great to see a number of faces here, obviously interested in what's going on around us in the world today, in Vermont specifically today as well. My name is Paige Vignola, if you don't know me. I'm the assistant director here at the library. I put together programming, and at the request of a number of patrons, I asked State's Attorney Erica Marthage if she would be willing to come in today to discuss or give a little bit of a presentation, so some background information, but then answer questions that Vermonters might have about the rights of individuals under the Vermont Constitution and in federal law. And what better person to address such a thing as State Attorney. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I just wanted to start. I know a lot of you already, but I wanted to welcome everybody for coming. I'm a big fan of Kahoots, actually, not PowerPoints, but I was really struggling with time this week. So we ended up with a PowerPoint, but we'll try to make it interesting. So I just want to welcome everyone here, and I wanted to this is the basic agenda. I'm mainly going to talk about what an executive order is, and then what state law is and federal law is, how they intersect. This is going to be as apolitical as possible. I'm not here to preach about our current president, past presidents. I'm here to talk about the law. I'm hoping that it is a good discussion and we can all talk about our viewpoints. So I'm not here to talk about politics or provide a platform for others to argue about politics. I hate using the term safe space, but this is definitely this is a space where I want everyone to just be able to ask questions. I will answer you to the best of my ability. I'm not going to make stuff up. I am not a constitutional law expert. I practice criminal law. I've been the state's attorney since 2006. I did a sentencing this morning. You know, my job is enforcing the law, child protection, adult guardianships. I am not a constitutional law expert. Obviously, I run into constitutional law every day in my job. So, and I'm not offering legal advice. I just need to say that. But I am here to have a respectful conversation. I'm also, you know, a mom, a daughter, a wife. I've lived here my whole life. I was educated here. I went to Burton. I went to UVM. And I moved back here when I got out of law school in Connecticut because I wanted to be part of this community, more importantly, the state of Vermont. I love the state of Vermont. And so some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about is, it's important that we're in the state of Vermont because a lot of Vermonters they think how I think. We want to live our lives. We want to have good lives. We want to have quality communities. We don't, we tend to not get as wrapped up in some of the drama, and that's how I like it. So I like being here. That's why I came back, and I hope that's why everyone is here tonight. So what is an executive order? I'm not going to talk at you all night, so I literally have like 10 slides that are like the very basics of what an executive order is, because it's been all over the news. So an executive order is a written directive signed by the president that orders the government to take specific actions to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. So an executive order is not the same as a federal law. It's not. We have our separation of powers, the different branches of government. Article 2 is what addresses the executive branch and allows for the president to issue executive orders to enforce federal law and to put forth the administration's policies. So where does that come from? Because I know that it seems like he's just the current president, President Trump, and frankly, I'll get to this later, but every president has issued executive orders, every single one. That's what they do to establish the policies and the important things that that administration wants to focus on. So, but the interesting thing is, it's really not written anywhere specifically. There is no place in the Constitution that specifically says you are allowed to issue executive orders. In Article 2, there is a very specific, and I definitely didn't want to put all these super boring citations and all that in there, but it's from, my husband's horrified back there because he's like history guy with all this kind of stuff, but what I know is it comes out of Article 2 in typical legal fashion. The Constitution creates the delegation of the president to issue executive orders to enforce the federal law. Or funding, right? So that's what we're hearing a lot about now. The president can issue executive orders to try to interpret federal law, to try and mold various agencies within his administration. But we're hearing a lot about the Department of Education. Those are agencies that the president and those are executive branch agencies. So there's no specific clause, but there are mountains of Supreme Court cases, U.S. Supreme Court cases that talk about that executive orders are legal as long as they are supported by the Constitution and they are part of the executive branch. They're addressing issues that the executive branch addresses. So what if they don't agree? What if the executive orders are not consistent with some of the state law or federal law? Well, since it is only for enforcing federal law, it could supersede state law if it is directly on point. So one distinction that I think is a good example is in federal law, one of the executive orders that may deal with gender does not include the language gender identity. Gender identity is in, for example, Vermont's Constitution. That's been addressed. So since they are not directly addressing the same point of law, that's why there have been a bunch of lawsuits filed already by various states. Most recently, the one that is addressing individuals that identify as women in female prisons that are now, one executive order is trying to prevent female identifying prisoners from remaining in a female prison. Well, the first constitutional argument for that is, well, it's cruel and unusual punishment to take an individual that is an identifying female and put them in a prison with all men. So there have been a number of courts, federal courts, that have already stopped that from happening. So the scary part is where we are now, right? Because all these orders are coming out and you're reading about it in this news cycle all the time. And remember, news is there to drum up business and scare you and get fear going and get everybody, up in arms about various things. And I'm sure everyone here has positions that they feel strongly about, but then there are going to be some people that don't agree with you and they feel just as strongly about that. So if you dig around long enough, you're going to find news that absolutely supports what you're saying. And then you have a community that is really fractured because you're at odds with each other. I was just saying before I started speaking, my brother and his best friend, they've been best friends since they were 15 years old. And since the maybe 2016 election, their friendship has been significantly fractured. And it's sad. This is the part where we're just kind of hanging on and seeing where everything goes in the court system. It's way no fun for the people that are not involved in the court system, that are part of the groups that have a very vested interest. Their daily living is being impacted. That causes fear. But we've had a history in this country of executive orders, and I'll get to those in a bit, of huge gravity that have had lasting impacts on our society, and it takes time to work its way through the court system and to get to a final resolution.
I have a quick question on the prison situation. Now, aren't most prisons state, not federal prisons?
Oh, no. No.
It's the other way. Okay.
So, and that's an interesting point, because that would be, so
Right.
this feeds directly into this, and anybody who grew up here, I was very, very opinionated and interested in the fact that they were changing the drinking age from 18 to 21 when I was like 16. And so it was a governor's highway safety funding that is federal money that comes from the federal government. Vermont was one of the last states to raise the drinking age to 21 because they, and I believe it was Madeline Kunin was the governor. I actually think we took a class trip there. Like, that was like the #1 question on all of our minds. Like, why are you gonna, you better not agree to up the drinking age. It was millions of dollars that we were gonna lose federal highway money. So ultimately, Vermont capitulated because it made sense. Now, of course, in the line of work that I'm in, it absolutely makes sense. It should be 40 as far as I'm concerned, but the federal highway money, and this is something interesting that I just found out about because I hadn't been paying attention. It occurred to me not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, how can New Hampshire get away with no motorcycle helmets? Because I was like, they must lose millions of dollars from that. They do. I looked it up. They lose like huge money, $75 million or something like that. But because the state of New Hampshire is so adamant that it's our right to do that, to ride our motorcycles without helmets, they have made that decision. And because I actually looked it up, so how do they fund like road crews and all that? They fund them with taxes. So that's a perfect example of something that many years ago, the federal government, one of the administrations, I don't remember who it was it, who, I don't want to date anybody, but was it Carter or Reagan with the seatbelts? One of those administrations was, remember, they didn't have seatbelts like even when I was a kid. And then one of the administrations decided seatbelts, everyone has to wear seatbelts. Well, they attached it to federal funding. So one of the ways that state maintains its autonomy, a state can maintain its autonomy by saying we're just not going to take the federal money. And that's some of the stuff that you're already seeing come up.
With that in mind, do you know what percentage of the education budget of Vermont comes from federal money?
I don't actually know that because I don't work in education, but I only work with the kids that don't go to school. I have no doubt that it's probably a lot, although I did find that's a whole other interesting conversation, right? I went to school here, so school choice was a big deal. Not so much for me then, because I lived here and I didn't know any different, but when I'm raising my children now, I have 3 kids in school. That's all important. For a long time, we had the Manchester School Fund that was another funding stream for schools. And I do, like, this is an example of something where I think, because we could differ, right, because the funding structure they're talking about is school vouchers. Well, I mean, is that super far from what we do? I don't know. Like, I'm not, I don't do the finances for the Department of Education, but it's curious to me. Do I think we scrap a whole organization like the Department of Education? Probably not. I think that maybe that's a little rash, but you know, what we're down to now is waiting for the courts to make their decisions, and some of them have already happened. We've had a number of federal courts that have issued stays on a number of executive orders. We've had a number of governors that have been very vocal that, fine, we don't want your money. The difficult thing is we're not able to have that conversation directly with every constituent, right? So you have a governor in the state, like, for example, I don't know if anybody saw it. My husband showed it to me. I wish he hadn't. The interaction between the president and the governor of Maine. And I look at everything through a lens of, I work in a field where when I was elected in 2006, I was the only female state's attorney. I was pregnant. It was brutal. So when I see the male-female dynamic, that's what I'm honed right in on that power dynamic. But for me, it's an interesting question, because the governor of Maine is taking a very strong stance, yet she answers to a constituency that may or may not agree with her. So that's why it's not like we live in a society, a federalist government, a democracy is not something that can respond immediately. So everything is through elections and through the courts. So any of the orders that are found to be directly adverse to anything in the Constitution, and I was saying before I was speaking with folks about the birthright citizenship, that's a clear, 14th Amendment violation. Like, that's, the courts are going to deal with that, but it seems to me to be a no-brainer. We've dealt with the 14th Amendment issues so many times before. I do hate kind of the emotions are up here about when we're talking about something that, and I wonder if some of it's not intentional. These are some of the executive orders throughout time. And I printed this because some of the information about it was so interesting to me. FDR, the undisputed king of the executive order, issued 3,721 executive orders during his 12 years in office. Most presidents issue a few hundred or less.
But he was also there for 12 years.
Right. Few, very few, have a lasting impact. And then I found these, they listed these 10. So obviously the Emancipation Proclamation, funding for the Manhattan Project, I did not know that was by executive order. I'm sure you knew that. But I had no idea that that
was through Congress.
So what it tells me, and this was actually the History Channel, which I love, said and I focus on like all the personal life stuff about like famous people. So I've listened to the book Catherine the Great like 50 times because I just love hearing about all of kind of the issues with her personality and things she's done, or she did. Yeah, it says that FDR issued on December 7th, 1941 is when Pearl Harbor happened, but months earlier, FDR issued Executive Order 8807, creating a government agency overseeing scientific research into defense technology. Funding from the newly created Office of Scientific Research and Development paid for the massive top-secret nuclear weapon program known as the Manhattan Project. Didn't know that. More than 130,000 people contributed, and it cost about, in today's money, would be $29 billion. The mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, clearly one of the darkest chapters. I did a presentation on this for Law Day at the elementary school with Attorney Brad Myerson. I don't know for anybody who probably knows him. He was trying to convince me that I had to, we were debating each other and he wanted me to argue the side for. And I was like, I'm an elected official. You are never going to get me to stand in front of a group of anybody and be like, yeah, this is why we need to do this. But that was an executive order that authorized the U.S. Secretary of War to prescribe military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. And as a result, 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them were U.S. citizens by birth.
An interesting contrast to how German American citizens were treated.
Right. They, the desegregation of the U.S. military was by executive order, and that was Harry Truman. Yep. LGBTQ workers were barred from government jobs in 1953, and that was due, in part, what I read about that I thought was like, I don't even know how you make that connection, was McCarthy was claiming that gay and lesbian individuals were communists. So they, part of the Red Scare, he was able to use it as a way to prevent LGBTQ folks from having government jobs. So Eisenhower signed that. That ban was not fully lifted, if you can believe it, until 2017, when President Barack Obama signed another executive order that undid the previous one. The National Guard being deployed to desegregate public schools, that was actually a court case. When the U.S. Supreme Court did Brown v. Board of Education, the governor sent in military to stop the Arkansas 9 at that point, Little Rock 9, from getting into school. And Eisenhower issued an executive order authorizing the deployment of the National Guard and active duty military to enforce the federal law. So the creation of the Peace Corps, that was one of JFK's executive orders. The affirmative action in government contracting in 1965. And that was an FDR.
No.
I'm sorry, FDR barred it, right, and then LBJ did the executive order, which I don't know if what I didn't read was whether these numeric, because this is executive order 11,246. I don't know if that's tied. I'm looking at Brian, he's like, I don't know. The pardon of Richard Nixon, that was by executive order. And the creation of Homeland Security in 2001 was George W. So, but what do we do as a community about all of this? I think being able to have conversations, reasonable conversations, it's not, no topic really should be off limits to talk about with friends and neighbors and feel like it's a personal thing, with the caveat that it is personal for some people, right? Like some of these executive orders are directly impacting the rights of individuals in our community. So I can't believe, as the state's attorney, I'm saying, the ACLU in Vermont has a strong chapter, but the ACLU, that would be the contact for Vermont, and I have that up here. The ACLU nationwide has filed innumerable lawsuits since their beginning. And they have, what's interesting is, people assume that it's, well, that's a liberal or a progressive organization. It's really not. They don't like me. I don't know specifically why. I've never spoken to any of them, but I think they just don't like prosecutors, but in Vermont anyway. But the U.S. chapter, the overarching, they have represented the NRA. They have represented, it's all about rights and individual freedoms. It's not about the political, they've represented neo-Nazis because it's the freedom of expression that they are defending. And so, if you have an interest in any of this, a deeper interest, the ACLU, this is the ACLU Vermont.org. If you just go to aclu.org, they have a great presentation with all kinds of attached resources, phone numbers for reaching out to organizations for you locally, if you want to volunteer, if you want to donate money, if you literally need help with something. I put vermontlawhelp.org. If you yourself or someone that's worried about any of these executive orders and whether they would have an impact on their lives and their livelihood, then you can contact vermontlawhelp.org. A lot of this mentally is a lot. I was on a panel last night with one of the doctors from United Counseling, and it was so interesting chatting with her after, because she was just talking about the extreme increase in anxiety since COVID. And now with this new chapter, she's seeing a lot more anxiety and stress. So 988 is a hotline for mental health crisis. Suicide, everybody used to just call it the suicide hotline. It's really mental health, for mental health crisis. So, if you're struggling with depression or anxiety, one thing she said that was upsetting to hear is just there's a significant increase in depression in young kids since COVID. So outrightvermont.org, they're an organization in Burlington that they have a lot of great information on their website for LGBTQ community. If you want to get involved, donate money, just learn more. When you're educating yourself, just please look at, reputable things. Every now and then I'll be reading something like, I absolutely love Arnold Schwarzenegger, and 5 years ago I completely freaked out because I picked my phone up and it said that he died, and I was like, what? And I'm like grilling my family about it. Did you hear about this? Is this real? Of course it was fake news, but it looked real. And so I just would encourage you to kind of look a little deeper when you're reading whatever pops up on your feed. And it never hurts to actually ask folks like Paige at your library, what are some good resources to look at? Even if you come in here and jump on the computer and look at some of this information, it's really helpful. There are a couple of really good learning segments on YouTube, and I was kind of joking with Paige about, Schoolhouse Rock, of course, was the best. and I literally looked for one, and then I was like, I don't know, am I going to get in trouble for copy? I don't know what I'd get in trouble with, but those are 50 years old at this point. But, how a bill becomes a law but here it's a very specific issue. What does an executive order have to, how does that impact us? So I definitely, because this was billed as a Q&A, I definitely wanted to save time for that. I don't have all the answers. I can try to help, and certainly talking about it is always Paige.
Erica, can you address the process for, so an executive order and then there's been like a temporary hold on the executive?
Yep.
Can you address how that process works?
So an executive order, so clearly for this presidential administration, they came in and immediately had a whole stack of executive orders. Typically, it doesn't happen that quickly. And the way to look at it is it's like the long game. So you have the executive orders, they're signed, they're issued. As soon as those hit the ground, you have organizations like, I want to say the ACLU filed their first lawsuit within 90 minutes of the first executive order being issued. They knew it was coming. So once they file a lawsuit, for a lawsuit to be filed, you need a person or an organization, you need essentially a plaintiff that's going to be the person that's the subject. So you would need to have someone identified as a person. One of the lawsuits I was reading about, the one involving female identifying women in a prison I think there were 3 inmates that were identified to be the plaintiffs for that lawsuit. So then it gets filed at the federal court level. So for us, our federal courts are in Rutland and Burlington. It gets filed at the federal court level, and then those are the judges that have been staying these from going any further. And that's when they're identifying, does this violate the Constitution? If it violates the Constitution, that, a lot of them that are being stayed, those are the obvious ones. The ones that are a little grayer, they may still be stayed, but, maybe they're not, and things start to roll out, like some of the immigration issues that have been happening with ICE agents and Homeland Security agents going into communities. They're federal employees. They can't dictate to state and municipal people what to do. So if they show up and I'm, say, at the police department, and they show up and say, we're going to go do whatever, and you have to come with us, we can say, no, I don't. That's that separation of powers thing. So at the federal court level, that's what they're fighting about, whether it's constitutional. And if it is, then the question is, does this enforce a federal law? If it's just funding, that's much grayer, right? Because the president, ultimately, the president's administration has authority over all of the programs that are funded by the federal government. Executive orders don't become law. Like, they don't just magically become law. Laws are only made by Congress. So if they decide, if there's an executive order and it gets stayed by a federal court, then of course there's lots of motion practice around either appealing it to another court or setting it for a hearing. It's mostly probably briefed. The U.S. Supreme Court has heard a few cases lately. The one that I think we're kind of all waiting, I don't think a decision's issued, on the, I think it was a transgender student. I think it was a student, and I haven't heard that there was a decision in that one yet. Once we get to the U.S. Supreme Court, then it's, and how long does all this take? So when we were in Canada, we had someone say, yeah, you just need to kind of wait and see how it all turns out. And that's scary when you're talking about, in some situations, people's lives, right? So, that's it. That's how it becomes an executive order. It's essentially whatever policy I mean, in the bigger picture, it's a policy agenda, essentially, right? It's like playing a big game of chess. You're trying to get, the president and his administration is, and this happens every time, they're trying to push their agenda. And sometimes, like, I see the one involving birthright as citizenship as like, almost like a red herring, because that's so on its face, not constitutional. We fought this fight. You know, there are decades of US Supreme Court decisions saying that the 14th Amendment grants that. But then when you get into, so it feels to me like it's almost like a chess game. You're putting all of these things out there because, you know, maybe these are things that were part of your political agenda or your platform or whatever it is you're trying to advance. It's almost like putting everything out there and seeing how much sticks, right? And in the meantime, we're going to tie up federal courts. It takes me 2 years to get, you know, a simple assault through criminal court. In Bennington, I can't imagine, like, some of the sheer number of hours that go into litigating just one of these executive orders. So I don't know if that answered your question, but how do they become executive orders? They write them. That's it.
No, I meant more along the lines of when there's an executive order and then there's a stay, right? There's like a prescribed period of time
Yep.
that the lawyers involved have to be able to
Yes.
find evidence to determine.
Yep.
So how long is that, and then how long, I mean, what's the next step in that process?
Oh, so you're talking like actual criminal, like civil procedure. So it's, yeah, so they stay the decision. Everyone, you know, is briefing whatever their arguments are. You're going to make a decision about if you're the plaintiff, you've already kind of gotten your way, right? Sorry. It's the Manchester Police.
Ours being used.
So they, so once you've kind of already achieved, at least in the short term, what you want, right? You've stated it. So an analogy would be like when I get someone held without bail that's a really violent offender, I don't care how long they take to like get their act together to come back to court. Because so for the attorneys, the ACLU attorneys, they've achieved a stay. I believe there are some prescribed dates on those, but dates in any court, timeframes in any court system are like, what do they call them? They're like prescribed. 99% of the time, that's not what's happening. So they'll be filing their motions, making their arguments. Literally, no matter how it comes out, they'll appeal it. It'll go to either another court or to the US Supreme Court. And I imagine there'll be a significant flurry of these. So we're talking, you know, a year or years.
And the stay is in effect for that entire time until there's a decision?
Oh yeah, and this is, so if you're the plaintiff, I get my stay, I'm moving on. I'm gonna be like, yeah, whatever, whenever you're ready, we'll come back and argue about this, because I've, in effect, gotten what I want in the meantime. If I'm the defendant, the respondent, the president's administration, I'm going to decide, do I want to spend my time arguing the merits of this, or am I going to spend my time arguing whether this should be stayed? A good example of for example, with the prisons, the reason that was stayed, and that'll be stayed until it's absolutely sorted out, because the harm to not staying it is so significant. You know, we're talking cruel and unusual punishment is, you know, you can't just say the harm would be already done. So, you know, I don't envy any of those, I was going to say judges, but you know it's going to be their clerks that are working away on all the,
So in situations like that, because you're seeing things that are stayed and then another judge comes along and says, oh no, we're not keeping that stay, but so a lot of it is coming down to decisions on how bad they think it will be for people or individuals? Or?
Well, that's definitely that's the matrix, what I've been listening to with and reading about with the executive orders that are directly impacting, for example, medical treatment for gender affirming, particularly for younger. So I heard an interesting piece about, and I forget what they call it with puberty, where you're essentially putting it off.
Blockers.
Right. So you have a 9-year-old that's starting to go through puberty. That's too soon. The parents don't want that to happen, but then, you know, here comes an order that says, okay, we're gonna, you know, some kids can have it because they're blocking puberty because they're 9. Those are the ones that I think are the stakes are so high if you just, to stop what already's been happening. It's not like you're preventing something from happening. This has already been, you know, this youth or this person has already been engaged in gender affirming treatments, and then you're all of a sudden gonna say, no, we're gonna stop that while the court sorts it out. The court almost always is gonna say, yeah, I mean, their goal, of course, is to sort it out without creating the harm that's being argued against. So, I mean, but it'll take a significant amount of time, and it's gonna be down in the legal weeds, right? It's gonna be, we're gonna start talking about different constitutional amendments and very specific language from cases for hundreds of years, and my daughter just did a piece on the Constitution, and it's hard because I don't know if anybody's read it lately, but it's like so vague, because I was reviewing Article 2 again for this, and I'm like, yeah, this definitely says nothing about executive orders, but that's kind of why, right? It's a living document. Like, if we didn't have the ability to have it change as time, it wouldn't be worth anything. So I think anybody who wants to like spend some time really digging into specific topic, you know, you really should check out some of those websites, because I completely fell down the rabbit hole of the ACLU on the national website, just because they've done a lot. It was a lot of really interesting legal work. There's always judicial review of the executive orders too. So like if it's somebody files something, like in any of these ones that have had lawsuits filed, the judicial branch is reviewing it. It just needs to make its way all the way up to because no matter what the circuit judge says, somebody's going to be unhappy.
What issues has the state of Vermont joined either with other states or why not?
So, yeah, our Attorney General has worked pretty closely with the Attorney General in New York State. So I know that Attorney General Clark has signed on to a number of lawsuits, and she has not filed anything specific separately from the state of Vermont, but she's joined in the ones that, the executive orders that are addressing the medication, gender affirming medical treatment, you know, family planning, funding, the immigration. She issued a statement not too long ago, because it's interesting, because she's state as well. They issued an advisory opinion essentially to all of the local, state and local law enforcement, just indicating yeah, there's this executive order out there, but, I mean, we just keep doing our jobs, so I'm not executing search warrants looking for folks that are in violation of an immigration statute. That's a federal law.
Attorney General Clark is going to do a question and answer on March 17th, by the way, so that's on our website. If you have questions you want to submit to have her address, you can check that out too, because yeah, she will be addressing questions put to her by people on 17th.
And this is on the Attorney General's website, ag.vermont.gov. I think I just said that right. There is a list of all of the current actions that the Attorney General is taking
Yep.
towards the executive orders. It's a long list. I said it after the fact. So let's say, for instance, there is a stay on any of these issues, and the stay is not being respected. Who enforces the stay? So, in the case of funding, let's use something that's a little less
Right.
personal. Well, I shouldn't say that, but if it's funding for education, and the stay is that you can't just stop the funding for education, but then, the checks don't come out because the computers aren't working, or the printers, we can't get ink for them, or whatever the case is that they
Yep.
make. How does that come back into the system to say, no, you're not, we said this can't happen?
So that would be then whoever the plaintiff is in the lawsuit. So it's going to be the ACLU, and it would come in the form of either an injunction to stop what they're doing that's violating the stay, or, a motion for a particular thing, or a protective order, like if it's, they haven't cut checks, or they haven't provided the money, or,
Is that a criminal?
But doesn't that all come down to
Like,
law?
at what point does that become?
When does somebody go to
It's
jail
not-
because they're not printing the checks? And who goes to jail? I mean, seriously.
Well, who puts them in jail?
Yeah.
Doesn't it
Yeah,
come
it's
down
not
to
gonna
law
be-
enforcement?
yeah, maybe. I mean, it's not us.
Right.
It's not this law enforcement.
Because that would be feds. If we're talking about fed issues and fed money. not
Well, and
coming
it wouldn't
through.
be, if it's an executive, we're talking about like very obscure, not obscure, very gray because I can't answer, like if somebody's breaking the law, then that's very different than violating the conditions of a stay. That, they could be held in contempt, they could be, but I mean, we've seen that, where public officials have been engaging in contemptuous behavior. And,
How much coordination is going on between the states, for instance, the AGs, and then, I'm from California, so I always obviously watch California and the politics there. I have family there. But, when we're talking about like federal monies for disasters, the FEMA monies and
Yep.
stuff. And then I'm just very curious, I know like California sends more money out to the feds than other states do, and other states receive more, but if resources like that are going away, is there a way for the states to coordinate and help each other on these types of situations?
yeah, and that would be a good question for Attorney General Clark. I don't, in the same vein that she's not in criminal court every day, I don't do her job. So she's the one that gets invited to all of I have no authority to file a lawsuit on behalf of the state of Vermont. I have the authority to file criminal charges on behalf of the state of Vermont. And I have filed civil suits on behalf of the county. But I can't answer what she's doing to coordinate. I know that Vermont has just signed on with multiple lawsuits. So we're not alone on any of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did find out the number, by the way. 37.7% of Vermont's governments, that's inclusive of state and local municipalities, get their, some federal, that's the amount.
For
total
education?
amount of money. No, total amount of money for all projects. 11% is for education.
Now, I'd be curious, though, what it is in New Hampshire.
I don't know.
Because they clearly just seem like, screw you guys. Like, they just are doing, we are being free. And like, you,
No sales tax.
right, we're doing whatever we want, and we don't care what you say. So it is interesting. I have to wonder if their pocketbooks being
Yeah.
hit at all. But,
There's actually, their total revenue is 25.9%. So less federal revenue by 12%.
a lot. That's quite a bit.
And it's a larger state, so,
Yeah,
yeah.
that does not surprise me. I think it's fascinating. But,
I'm sorry, I was handling another issue before, so I'm sorry if I missed this. For many folks, I think the concern about the state, Idaho, which is now asked the Supreme Court to revisit Obergefell v. Hodges, which is marriage equality. The state of Vermont obviously has already made marriage equality part of its law. But the concern is that if the federal government begins to remove, or does, like the state Supreme Court says that it wasn't justified and overturns that, and marriages were created throughout the United States,
yep.
are those marriages still valid, even in states that don't have marriage equality?
Oh, Brian knows the answer to that, Mr. Divorce Lawyer. I was just going to say, on the immigration thing, it's not, it's prospective. So I don't know if you have a different answer on marriage.
Marriage is a state creation, not a federal creation.
True.
So any state, so the federal government may not recognize your marriage, so that if you have a same-sex partner, you can't do marriage filing jointly, for example, for tax purposes. But under the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution, if your marriage is recognized in the state where you were married, then all of the other states are also required to recognize your marriage.
Thank you.
There.
Yeah. No, as a family who has VA benefits and insurance, we have our children, because they were in foster care,
Yep.
receive
Stipends, yep.
stipends and Medicaid, and the amount of money is determined based on the size of your family.
Yep.
The amount of effect that could, the whole breadth of these executive orders and changes and Supreme Court decisions has right now on our family is monumental. It's like potentially, not even just from the perspective of the money that we have made part of our day-to-day life, our ability to have, health insurance that's affordable, recovery from an injury in the military, all of those things are
Yeah.
potentially being wiped away, and then the cost of then replacing said things,
Right.
like health insurance, it's, I can't even put it into perspective how big of a deal it is. So that's kind of where that question comes from, because so Brian, thank you for your answer on that. We lived the part when my husband and I first were married.
Yeah.
It was when marriage equality had been overturned. Marriage equality had been, the Supreme Court said, there is marriage equality, and then Don't Ask, Don't Tell was overturned. We were in the military. We had a marriage, but the military said, no, no, we don't that doesn't exist. And we had to, even though we were married, we still had to pay for our own housing.
Yeah.
Except, like, I didn't get a pass to get on post, so we were definitely there. And it was a great day. I was one of the first people in the US to actually get a spouse's ID.
In the military.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks to, several calls to the Pentagon, actually, in the White House, because there were people who were just sitting there. We asked about who's gonna monitor this day. Well, the person who was behind the computer went, well, we don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And, so we've certainly been on that end, and I think now it's the part about losing it. It's
Right.
because we've lived with it since 2012.
Well, and I think that's where we're at, right? With it's not just your family, it's many families that are struggling with, the last time when we had to deal with families being broken up. I do child protective work, so I've physically been there when I've had to break up families. And the idea that that would be happening in any situation where there isn't abuse or neglect is like beyond. And I don't ever get political because I'm not elected to be that person. I'm elected to address public safety. So that's what I do. But that one I had really, really strong. And I'm concerned about that again with kids that live in our country that are now currently with their parents and may not stay there. I think for individuals that are, they're not the folks sitting here, the folks that don't have appropriate immigration documents or, and I'm a law enforcement officer, so and anybody who knows different, don't say anything, but I'm a rule follower, so I'm looking at you. But so I have no issue with the frustration, and I'll give you my very poignant view of it. For years, I have been contacting Homeland Security to have very particular, very violent individuals that continue to break the law in our county addressed. And I haven't seen them for that. I have seen them show up at court for someone who's caught with some marijuana, who's here on a green card, working at one of the colleges. So my level of frustration is like here, because it's been 20 plus years where I'm saying, here's this guy who has been, dealing guns and drugs and, beating his kids up, and you can't be bothered to come down here and do something about it.
To their office?
So, so there's that, at the end of the day, I think everyone has to feel like they have some trust in their government and their officials and their community. And, when we're in a situation where everyone is feeling afraid and they're not sharing concerns they may have because they're worried that how that might impact their daily life. So, I always try to remind myself that, these are third world problems for me, health insurance is a fundamental right. But having your kids taken away is or having no due process, I struggle with that too, for individuals that are arrested for immigration violations. If there's no due process, our whole country is built on due process. So, Well, that was all a really depressing road, but,
We just saw the executive saying that all people who are illegal are supposed to register. So, like, really?
well, this is how, I'll tell you a secret. This is how gun laws work. The people that we have the biggest issues with are not the people. They're registering their guns. So like, you know, yeah, so
Yeah.
I fundamentally agree that we should be keeping guns out of the hands of children and, you know, criminals. But criminals are the ones using the guns for nefarious reasons. So,
That's what makes them criminals.
yeah, right. So it sounds like you're going to have Charity here on the 17th, so,
She's not going to be here, it's a virtual town hall.
Oh.
So it's going to be online only, and GNAT is going to be running that show. No pun intended.
yeah.
But, yeah, so that's going to be on the 17th, and it's at, I want to say, 5:30 to 6:30.
She's the one to ask about, like, the status of the lawsuits and all that.
How do we get information, how do we get on?
So on the library website, all of our events, all of our upcoming events are there, and then on the library website for that event, which again is March 17th, there's a link to all the GNAT streaming channels, as well as a link to a forum where you can submit a question. If you have anything in particular that you would like to ask, you can submit that question there.
All right, I don't want to keep everybody. It's dinner time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I don't have all the answers, so I have very few. But,
Thank you.
yeah.